Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Alex's Afternoon Art Show. Today it is really warm, and so I'm drawing Ghost Rider. And I suppose it's appropriate that we are going to be drawing a character with fire on his head because, yeah, with all the hell and all that stuff. Because, yeah, it is hot as hell in here. Good God. Alright, you might be able to hear it, but the fan is on, so that will be a necessity. Anyways, so as I mentioned, we're drawing Ghost Rider. I didn't even really talk about the topics. I just sort of did that intro and didn't really think about it. But yeah, anyways, so I've got a few things to talk about this time. We're going to be talking a little bit about effects and stuff like that, and also I'll have some stuff to talk about in terms of perspective, because as you can see, there's a little bit of that going on. Not a huge amount, but a little bit. And I also kind of have to talk about a few sort of unusual things. Character props is something I kind of have to talk about here. Because usually whenever I do one of these, I usually don't really do many sort of character props, so to speak. As in, things that the character has. Whether that be weapons or sort of vehicles. I might do a weapon here or there. A lot of characters would usually have a weapon or something like that. Or some sort of thing maybe that they're holding or something or other. But like I wouldn't normally do like them just holding like a cup or something like that. It's very rare would it be that I'd have something just simple and like that. And even rarer is it that I'd have a character on a vehicle of some variety or a mount. So it's something different for this one. I don't usually draw those sorts of things. And so I suppose I have to talk about it. So there's a little bit of sort of perspective here on the wheel that I actually have to talk about. Because what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to make this wheel bigger, because the way I've done it is not quite right. Now, this is sort of right in that you should be seeing the sort of kind of a little bit of the interior of the wheel here, but because the wheel's turning, the idea is I'm going to have these sort of fire effects. They're going to conceal parts of the bike that I don't want to have to draw, which I think is probably how most people use the fire effects on the wheels. And so what's funny about the bike is that I actually don't have to draw most of his body either. It's really I have to draw his legs and maybe his shoulders and his hands, and that's about it. And his head, obviously. But a lot of this stuff I don't actually have to draw. And Ghost Rider's not so hard in a lot of respects because I don't find drawing skulls terribly difficult. Some people do. And I don't find drawing fire very difficult, and some people do. So for me, it's actually kind of easy. For the most part, to draw Ghost Rider. I usually find that with drawing fire and stuff like that, it's really just sort of squiggle it out and that'll sort of do the general idea. Usually just sort of have a kind of a direction more or less that's moving, because fire usually sort of moves in waves and directions like that. It usually sticks to a reasonably consistent direction, especially if there's a sort of a prevailing wind or something like that. There's usually some sort of consistent direction of the wind, or to the fire. And so because he's riding the motorbike and he's moving fast, that means the sort of the fire, especially because he's sort of turning like this, he's kind of turning a little bit, as you can see, he's sort of like drifting the bike a little bit here. So the fire in his head is sort of twisting away from this side of his head, and it's pluming out more in this direction. And also he's sort of like yelling, so you've got all the fire coming out of his eyes and mouth as well. I usually draw the fire coming out of his eyes and mouth just because I think that looks cool. If his mouth was closed, I wouldn't have the fire coming out of his mouth, but I just think it looks cool. So that's usually why I go for that. Some people might have light coming from the eyes and mouth. I wouldn't. I usually keep them dark just because I think it looks sort of more menacing that way. And so, yeah, so as I said, we've got a little bit of perspective to talk about as well, because we've got this sort of like drift happening here, where this is a little further away, and then as it gets bigger and bigger, it becomes the wheel on the back. As we've also got chains to talk about, because in the immortal words of Todd McFarlane, kids love chains. So, I've got chains to talk about. Now, I don't have to worry too much about this, because I have a brush that does this for me for the most part. But I do have to sort of worry about how big it is. Because chain here, it's supposed to be sort of reasonably large and then it gets smaller as it goes back, because the idea is that it's sort of he's swinging it out, meaning it's sort of flicking behind him as well, because it's because he's moving. The sort of the movement is sort of dragging the chain away from him as he's flicking it out. Because I'm very conscious of the fact that the last time I drew Ghost Rider, it was a profile shot, and it was also not very good. And it was a sort of a weird perspective sort of thing that I was trying to do. And I gave my gun, and I didn't want to have to draw the chain. And I also obviously didn't want to draw the bike. But here, I'm kind of forced to. I forced myself to because it's sort of a bit of a cop-out to not do that. So here, as I say, I've done that. There's a few things which I'll have to change. I'll have to make the sort of the front of the wheel here bigger just so that perspective is more emphasized, that it's coming towards the camera. Now, to a certain respect, you should still be able to see the side of the wheel because he is turning the bike, so the front wheel of the bike should be turning away this way. And so there's a few things like that as well. Now, in terms of the design I've given him, it's the same design that I normally would give Ghost Rider. In that he's got these sort of thick shoulder pieces, and he's got the spikes in his shoulders and on the gloves and boots as well. But he's also got this sort of the little trim around the sort of collar of his jacket, and that also then has the two sort of straight lines that come out down the side, which would be a sort of blue tone. A lot of the little lines that I give him would be blue toned, just for the contrast. Because in his earlier designs, his jacket and stuff like that was blue. Now it's not necessarily just because it was supposed to be blue. That's also because in comics at the time they would print. They wouldn't want to print just flat black. They couldn't really print tones of grey so easily. So what they would do would be they'd supplant that or they would substitute that for blue. Where they'd use blue for a lot of these things. That's why like Wolverine's hair in the comics was blue at the time. Not because his hair is actually supposed to be blue, but because it was easier to print that. And so Ghost Rider's jacket is still supposed to be black, but I would blue tone it even just for the contrast against the orange, because the fire is orange, and blue goes well with orange. So they sort of nicely contrast each other in a certain respect. As a matter of fact, they're complementary colors. I'm trying to think of the color wheel in my mind. That's why I sort of paused there for a second. I don't recall off the top of my head. But our lighting here is obviously going to be very orange, very yellow. And our background is probably going to be fairly dark. But, yeah. So, with a certain respect here, we've got actually all three planes, which is something we don't normally have in terms of perspective. Something I don't normally have because I don't really do backgrounds in these. So I actually have all three planes. So we've got the front of the bike here, which is our foreground, and then we've got our middle ground, which is the character, and then we've got our background, which is the rest of the chain, and then also the fire behind it. So we've actually got a decent sort of layer of perspectives that actually adds a nice little bit of movement to the way things are going. I actually like how it's sort of, you can kind of clearly see the movement here of this. And again, that's what you get whenever you have all three planes. If you only have two of them, it doesn't really work so well. If you only have one of them, I mean, it's just too, it feels flat. And so yeah, I don't normally have backgrounds, so you don't normally get all three planes. But here, I still don't have a background, but I do still have things in all three planes. So it at least keeps things moving and feeling interesting that way. But yeah, is there anything else really to talk about? The fire effects are fairly easy. It's just, as I say, just sort of squiggle it out, and then I put an interior squiggle as well, of where I do two sort of layers of color. For the fire, of where I do sort of an inner fire color, which would be a yellow color, and then an outer fire color, which would be an orange color. And then they both have sort of different layers of glow to them, just so that, again, the fire has a sort of an interesting look to it. And it has a nice hard edge with the sort of the line around it as well. Because in some of the more recent stuff, I've been doing fire effects, we're doing them with paint, which for this sort of thing, you need to do it with, in my opinion, at least, you need to sort of have a sort of harder edge to it because it looks more defined, it looks more interesting. But yeah, whenever I sort of paint in the fire, it doesn't. I feel like a lot of the time it doesn't quite look right. It has to be sort of mixed exactly right in order to look correct to me, anyways. But yeah, so with the bike, I suppose there's a few things I maybe need to mention. Like with the way I drew it, it's mostly the sort of concentric pipes and things like that. I don't really like drawing vehicles or anything like that. It's mostly, if I'm gonna do it, I usually do it with a lot, and I mean a lot of reference, because I don't really like drawing vehicles or anything like that, because I find it difficult. And so, yeah. For the most part, it's just sort of little grills and little sort of bits of piping and all that stuff, and a lot of this stuff will be concealed by fire, so I don't have to worry about it. A lot of it will be concealed by fire. A lot of it will just sort of, I'll just be sort of coloring it all in more or less the same color, and then the paints will sort of, the shading and stuff like that will sort of emphasize it as metallic, I guess. I suppose lighting is going to be more of a concern in this one because we've got multiple different light sources both on the character and off, I suppose. I'm probably going to use the fire as the primary light source, and the background will be fairly dark. So that way it'll be sort of casting light on the character from below and above. I usually don't light the skull just because it looks better whenever it's just the flat white. To me at least, it looks better when it's flat white. I think I maybe did light it last time, but I don't think it looked very good. So yeah, I'm going to be keeping it to the flat white, I'd say, on the skull. And then just sort of the bits on his body will be lit by the fire. On his head and on the wheels. I'm trying to think, is there anything else I really need to cover? I won't do the chain or anything in this section because I have my brush for that, so I'll be doing that later. I'll paint that in with the sort of special chain brush. And then, yeah, I think I've covered everything. I talked about the lighting, I talked about the effects, I talked about the sort of perspective, I talked about all the different things. Yeah, I suppose if there's anything else that comes to me, I'll mention that whenever I come back after doing the details. Yeah, I'll do this and then I'll be back to talk about the colours, and I suppose if I've missed anything that I wanted to talk about, I'll talk about it then. So yeah. Alright, that is our details done. So, I should mention that I'm going to be doing the chain just with a brush. I didn't mention that before, I don't think. But I'm going to be having a brush that does that for me, so I'm going to do that after I've done the colors. So for the purposes of right now, you're not going to see it. Anyways. So yeah, I went through and I did all this stuff. I made the wheel a little bigger. I had to pull up my reference of the bike just so that I actually knew what I was drawing. And it's going to be very important for coloring. Because I don't know what each part is supposed to be color-wise necessarily, so that is going to be interesting. I added some extra detailing and things like that. Some of it's going to be covered up, but it doesn't really matter. But yeah, so I added sort of some of the flames sparking out from the wheel and things like that, just because I think that looks a bit more interesting. Adding the sort of lines there just sort of keeps it sort of the movement angle of it, and then the fire at the back here. Again, it doesn't necessarily look super clean. It's a little cleaner than the original, but again, some of the chain is going to be covering that, so it's not super important in that respect. But yeah, I might have. I'm curious actually how I'm going to have to do this chain, because I have to do some of it in front of the lines and the color, because it'll have to sit in there, and then some of it will have to be behind it because of this. So what I might do is I might do like up to the curl as in front and then the rest behind. Which is going to be awkward to try and match up that line weight, but I'm going to have to do something like that because it has to go behind the fire. Well, I'm going to have to think about that, but anyways, that's going to be awkward. But I think I'm going to have to do something similar with the fire, because I don't want, I'm going to have the fire glow, but I'm going to want to have, it's going to have to be behind the leg, because I don't want the glow sort of glowing onto the leg. I may have made this difficult for myself. Right. I'm going to have to do the background first anyway, so the background is literally going to be just very basic. I'm going to put like a little bit of like orange or something, like a little glow behind him, and then the rest is going to be a very dark color. So there's just sort of a little bit of light behind him, and then the rest is very dark. And I'm probably going to put a lot of texturing on this one, just because it should look sort of grimy, I think anyways. I think that's more interesting looking, but yeah, so the colors here, I thought they initially weren't going to take very long, but I'm actually going to have to separate a lot of things out into certain layers, which I would have otherwise put them all on the one. So the fire is going to have to be separated out into two sort of groups. There's going to be the front fire and then the back fire. I'm going to have to do the same thing with the chain, where it's going to be the front chain and then the back chain. I have to try and match up the chain to... I'm going to have to try and match up the two line weights. Which is going to be difficult. Try and loop that behind him in a way that looks convincing. And it still has to be... Well, alright, you know what? You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to erase parts of it. I don't know why I was even thinking about doing this the hard way. I'm just going to erase parts of it. I'm going to do it in front, because this still has to sit in front of that line. I just thought of that, and I'm... you know what? Yeah, I'm just going to do the chain as the one thing, and I'm just going to erase the parts of it that need to go. That's the easy way of doing it. I was going to do that a really needlessly hard way. But this is going to have to be separate, though. The two fires are going to be separate. Otherwise, that's going to get confusing. I don't want the glow to hit this. Or do I? I'm going to be lighting this that way anyways. You know, I don't actually think that matters, because I'm going to be lighting this leg and a lot of the top of him as though there is a glow hitting it, because the idea is the light source is the fire, so there should be a little bit of that anyways. Yeah, you know, I think I'm going to do that, actually. That makes sense. Not going to make my life too much more difficult than it needs to be, because, you know, it's just needless. Okay. Right. So, I've sussed out what the problem is, and it's my own brain. Overthinking it too much. Right. Yeah, that makes more sense. Just do the chain as normal, and then just erase the parts that overlap. With something that has to be in front, and then the fire all is the one layer, but maybe just don't give it too much glow, otherwise it's going to interact too much here. And this is more so what I'm concerned about with it interacting. Okay. That makes sense, right? Okay, I'll do these colors, and then you'll sort of see a little bit more of this come together. There's not going to be any lighting on the skull, so the skull has to be in front of everything, which is the intention. That'll be the first thing I color in, is the skull. That should be pretty easy to colour in because it's just going to be white. And none of the other sort of lighting is going to interact with it. It'll just be sort of the flat white skull. And I think that should look pretty good. As that being the only thing that's not interacting with the lighting at all. That makes sense to me. Yeah. Alright, I'll do these colours and then I'll be back to talk about the shading. Which is going to be a whole ordeal. Not really. It's just going to be all orange. Anyways, I'll move on. Alright, so that is our colours done, and I also did the chain and everything. I had to go through and manually put in the links because otherwise we have parts which are overlapping here and those are remarkably unclear without doing that. So yeah, so you can at least clearly see where things overlap, and then because I wanted it to be even more clear, I decided to have bits which are highlighted in orange, the idea being that, you know, I don't know, I guess that part of the chain is hot, and if you touched it, it would burn you. Maybe I'll paint a little bit of sort of heat around it, something like that, just sort of a bit of radiating something around it, just so that it has a bit more, looks a bit more interesting, does something more with the background anyways. Yeah, just something a bit more. But yeah, so far I think everything worked. I did all the effects and everything of the flames. I think it sort of, again, it does a good job of sort of blending everything together. Makes it look a bit more interesting with the glows and stuff like that on it. And yeah, so there's actually not a huge amount here which I have to shade, especially not in the paints, because some of these colors don't occupy enough space to really warrant it, although I'm probably going to have the painted shading be pretty intense. So yeah, the silver, this dark silver, the sort of white of that I'm not going to bother shading, blue I'm not going to bother shading, and the dark gray in the back. There's only 1, 2, 3, there's only 4 colors I actually have to shade, so that's not so bad at all. And then I might paint in just a little bit of something going on in the background, just so that it looks a bit more interesting, because I'm a bit conscious that that's a little boring looking. So yeah, that's probably what I'll do. I don't know if there's anything I really need to go into. With the sort of the colors on the bike, I don't think there's anything really all that interesting there to talk about either, to be honest. Yeah, I think I wanted this one to look a bit more classic, which I sort of did with a little bit of the roughness of the lines on his skull, just that they're all sort of very thin, kind of little hatchy lines. And because the skull isn't going to be shaded at all, that means that it's going to have, as I say, a sort of a very old-fashioned look to it. A lot of more modern art would usually shade the skull, but in a lot of sort of the very old Ghost Rider art, they wouldn't shade it, and I think that looks a bit more striking. So that's what I'm going to go for here. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything. Yeah, I don't think I have to mention anything else. I'll just do this painted shading, and then be back to talk about detailed shading and all that other stuff, which really there isn't a huge amount to talk about there, but you know, I'll do it anyways. Alright, so that is our painted shading. Now I realised while I was doing that I made a couple of errors. For example, there should be some black there, and there should be some fire down there. So I made a couple of errors, which I will have to fix. So I'll have to come back to those after I've done all the shading, because unfortunately I use the same colours for all this stuff, so I can't just eyeball it, I kind of have to hold the same colours here. So I'm going to do this first, and then I'll come back and fix those errors. So as you can see, I sort of laid in all the sort of general idea of this stuff, and the detailed shading is not going to be terribly long because, I mean, the painted shading already sort of serves the same purpose. That said, I do realize I did just forget to do also the background bit of painting, so we'll do that now as well. So yeah, I'll do this, I'll do the detailed shading, I'll fix those errors, and then I'll be back after I've done that, and also the light line, which I think it's just going to be a little orange around here, just sort of a little tiny dotting of orange around some of these edges. Probably won't even do that much. The lightest of light lines I'd say I'll do for this. And then yeah, start the gradient maps, which is just, you know, it's probably very obvious as to what that's going to be. Anyways, I'll do this stuff and then I'll be back. So this section might be a little longer. Right, that is basically us done. So, that is our detailed shading. I did that. That's right there. I fixed those colours. I put in a little bit of yellow behind there. And I put in the extra bit of black that was missing there. And then I also painted in some of our background stuff. I just sort of painted a bit of a sort of a vague, kind of messy kind of paint around the chain, and then I put in just some sort of splotches of red and yellow and stuff like that in the background, just to sort of give it something a bit more going on. And so yeah, then yeah, I think that was everything I needed to do. So I did the light line as well, just as I say, a very little bit of orange just sort of interspersed around. You can just sort of see around here and stuff like that, the inside of the foot and things like that. Nothing too intense, just didn't want it to be too distracting. The lighting is already doing enough. The lighting on its own is enough, you don't need that as well. And so then I did the gradient map. So I should mention a few things. This is something which I've been doing a lot recently, where I've been having the sort of top three be very close to the top. I mean, both of the top two here are at the very top. So it's a very sort of high contrast thing to do, of where even the middle tone is very high up, and then the two darkest tones are like right near the bottom. So yeah. And then this one is the very bottom, yeah. So that it just sort of, as I say, it's this very high contrast, very sort of brights, darks. Sort of that sort of thing. And so to emphasize the contrast, I decided to make the first gradient map an overlay layer. I would normally use a soft light, which is what this would look like, but I went for an overlay because it has this sort of deeper kind of reds to it, which I think looks good. It has a bit more red to it, a bit more red and orange, where the soft light is a bit more yellow, which I don't want. So right, that's at a little bit of a lower opacity. It's at 60%. Alright, next on the list, I need to do a luminosity layer, and I should make that a bit lower just so that it's Because here we still want this all to be very... we want all our bright areas to still remain very bright. We just want this to darken some of the dark areas a bit more. And so right now we're going to bring up the color burn, because that'll sort of saturate it up a little bit more. We're already going to want that to be about 10%. Now, I've been doing the fourth gradient map quite a bit recently, so I'm curious to see what something like hue would look like. Hue is not it. Saturation, perhaps? Saturation is also not it. Color? No. No, we already have that. Yeah, I'm conscious of deep frying this, because some of these do tend to, as you can see, just sort of deep fry it a little bit. I apologize if you're watching this on a small monitor of any variety. I just sort of, oh, okay, there we go. Yeah, that one's too much. Right, just sort of going through and testing some of these, because some of them are interesting to see how it looks. Sometimes the screen is definitely not that lighten, perhaps. Nope, that doesn't do anything. Darken, no. Linear, no. Color burn, that's already what we have. Multiply. Multiply isn't so bad. Darken. Maybe multiply and then turn it down a bit. Turn the multiply down to like 20%. So that sort of makes everything a little bit darker. Maybe 25, maybe 30. Makes everything a bit darker. It does hit the skull a little more than I would like, but... And honestly, I could erase out that area, but no, I'm not going to do that. I think that looks alright. Sort of puts everything a bit closer to the color tones. That's right. So now I'm going to grab my texture. But yeah, all this stuff, as I say, it's sort of important to emphasize all this stuff. So that's why I've been using a lot of the fourth gradient maps, just to sort of add that little extra bit of sort of saturation or sort of colorization to certain things. Like the last couple, I've been using them mostly for saturation or to add more of a sort of a softness to it, where here I'm trying to add sort of intensity or darkness. Trying to intensify our dark areas and then sort of brighten up our bright areas. We're going to want to leave the texture here pretty high as well. 20%. Let's have a look. I might even need to bring it up a bit more than that, because I want this to look kind of grimy. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to bring it up to 30. I want it to look kind of grimy in some of these areas that you can really see it. You'll really be able to see it in these areas. So yeah, you can see it around here a little bit. It'll brighten up some of this stuff. It'll be a bit blotchy in areas, but that's kind of fine. That'll look, as I say, it looks a bit grimier, which I want. I want this to look sort of messy and a bit kind of crunchy in areas, but not deep fried. That is a problem which can occur when you're doing the sort of color tones like this, of where you're using very sort of bright colors and sort of very dark shadows. Because yeah, the sort of higher your contrast, the more sort of you're losing that gradient in between. And so I try to be careful not to go too far in one direction. But yeah, I think here it works anyways. Because I mean, let me demonstrate what it looks like without any of this stuff. It's a bit flatter. It still sort of has a general idea, but it's a bit flatter. For here, a lot more sort of vivid. It has much sort of stronger contrast. Better shading, better dark areas, better bright areas, all this stuff. And sort of again, our skull here sort of remains still pretty bright. And the light on the front of the bike, even though probably didn't really need that. Half the time his bike doesn't have that. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. I don't know the maker model of the bike I used as reference, which is probably just as well. But yeah, it looks a bit like some of the ones that I've seen for him. It looks a bit like the one from the second movie. But yeah, where it has that little light on the front of it. But yeah, yeah, I think it's a bit more striking when the skull isn't shaded, because it looks a bit more sort of classic that way. Anyways, I think I've done enough rambling here. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with this one. I think it came out kind of exactly how I wanted it to. Yeah, sort of standard length on this one. It felt like a bit of a longer one, but I think that's just because I started a bit later in the day. and it's very hot, so I've had to do a lot more breaks than I would ordinarily like to. But yeah. Anyways, I think I'll wrap up, and then that'll be us. So yeah, if you like the video, do whatever it is that you'd normally do, whether that be liking it or not. Of course, prefer if you did like it, but you know, you don't have to. So do as you would. Same deal if you want to subscribe, go for it. I'd of course prefer if you did that, but you know, you don't have to. Nothing forcing you to, nothing stopping you either. It is free. So yeah, if you have a suggestion for what you'd like to see me draw in the future, you could leave that in the comments. You're actually always going to be ending soon enough, so sooner rather than later we'll be better on that. I may come back after the show is done, but you know, I can't guarantee that. So suggestions are welcome, but you know, if you've got something you really want to see, get it in sooner rather than later. And yeah, if you choose to watch the next video, I will see you next time. And with all that said, that is us. I will say goodbye and I will leave you. So, bye bye.